Welcome to the first episode of what I'm calling Meme Busters. The idea behind this series is simple. We're going to take some of the biggest recurring memes in Warhammer 40,000 and see how much they actually line up with the lore. And for our first victim, we're looking at the Lamenters. I've always had a fascination with the Lamenters. Unfortunately, their colour scheme combines yellow armour with checkerboard heraldry, which means I've spent years admiring them from a safe distance rather than attempting to paint them myself. Now, if you spent any time in the 40k community, you already know the meme. The Lamenters are unlucky. Not just unlucky, cosmically unlucky. The chapter that can never catch a break. The universe's designated punching bag. And to be fair, the lore seems to support this. They're repeatedly described as ill-fated, accursed, and dogged by misfortune. But when you actually examine the events that build that reputation, another interpretation starts to emerge, because a pattern appears throughout their entire history. The Lamenters consistently make morally idealistic choices. Those choices place them in impossible situations, and the disasters that follow may have less to do with supernatural bad luck, more to do with self-sacrifice, misplaced loyalty, and a refusal to abandon people who need help. So today we're going to ask, are the Lamenters genuinely cursed? Or are they simply too noble for the universe they live in? To understand where the reputation comes from, we need to start with their origins. The Lamenters were created during the infamous 21st Founding, better known throughout Imperial history as the Cursed Founding. The goal of this founding was ambitious. The Adeptus Mechanicus attempted to improve upon existing Space Marine gene seed and eliminate many of the flaws that plagued certain lineages. In short, they tried to improve on the Emperor's work, and that went about as well as you'd expect. Many of the chapters created during the founding developed bizarre mutations or suffered catastrophic fates. The Black Dragons grew bone blades from their bodies, the Flame Falcons were reported to spontaneously combust, the Firehawks disappeared entirely into the warp and likely became the Legion of the Damned, others were purged, corrupted, or simply vanished from history at the hands of the Inquisition. As a result, the 21st Founding became known as the Cursed Founding, and among its products were the Lamenters. Derived from Blood Angel's gene seed, they were intended to solve the flaws that haunted the Sons of Sanguinius for millennia: the Red Thirst, the Black Rage. At first, it appeared to work. The Lamenters seemed free from both curses, a miracle, so it seemed, because while they escaped the traditional afflictions of the Blood Angels, they soon developed a reputation for something else entirely. Disaster followed them everywhere. Their reputation became so severe that some chapters actively refused to fight alongside them. Partly, this was simple prejudice. The Heavy was just about to pick me up, and then he just wandered off to you. It's like, alright mate. Being from the Cursed Founding was hardly a glowing recommendation. After all, many of their sister chapters had either fallen to chaos, been destroyed, or suffered horrifying mutations. But regardless of the reason, the results were the same. The Lamenters often found themselves standing alone. One of the clearest examples came during the 9th Black Crusade. When the Black Legion attacked the Hive world of Corellia, the Mortifactors chapter reportedly abandoned the theatre of war rather than fight alongside the Lamenters. And this left the Lamenters with a costly decision: follow suit and leave the civilian populace to their fate at the hands of the Black Legion, or stand firm and defend the world alone. For 6 weeks they endured. Eventually, Ultramarine and White Scar reinforcements arrived, but by then the cost had been horrific. By the end of the conflict, only around 200 Lamenters remained, and then, because apparently the universe wasn't finished with them yet, the chapter disappeared into the warp shortly afterwards. They were presumed lost. A century later, they re-emerged, still alive, still fighting, still putting innocent Imperial citizens at the forefront of their concerns. Roughly 3 centuries after the events of the 9th Black Crusade, the Lamenters answered the Ultramarines' call for aid in the Caradon region. Believing they had a debt to pay to the Ultramarines after the defence of Corellia, the Lamenters dispatched a single battle barge, the Daughter of Tempests, along with 300 Astartes to aid the Sons of Guilliman. During the conflict, the Lamenters volunteered for what many considered a secondary objective: the liberation of Slaughterhouse 3. an orc mining world where Imperial citizens were being worked to death as slaves. The strategic value of the world was undeniable, but what drove the Lamenters was the fate of the prisoners themselves. The assault was a success. The orcs were driven back, and 3 million human slaves were freed. But victory immediately became a burden, as they had vastly underestimated the number of slaves the orcs had taken. The chapter lacked the ships to evacuate such a vast population, and enemy forces were already closing in. Most chapters would have completed their mission and withdrawn. The Lamenters refused. Instead, they chose to stay. Fewer than 200 battle brothers stood between the liberated population and the returning orc fleets at this point in the conflict. They fought on against impossible odds, sacrificing themselves to buy time while desperately trying to search for a way to save the civilians they had rescued. It is also worth noting that during this war with the orcs, Lamenters started falling to the Black Rage, something that aided them in matching the savagery of the orcs, but something they were meant to be immune to, which means their entire raison d'etre is somewhat unluckily null and void, considering they were created to remove this affliction. In the end, there was no miracle. Faced with the certainty of recapture and unimaginable suffering, the liberated slaves themselves chose death over slavery. The Lamenters were forced to grant them the Emperor's peace, destroying the mines and entombing millions beneath the world they had died to reclaim. The campaign was recorded as a strategic victory. The orcs lost a critical industrial world, and the Crusade advanced. But the Lamenters saw only the lives they had failed to save. When Marnius Calgar later offered the chapter honours for their actions, the Lamenters refused them. The next notable campaign for the Lamenters was another 200 years along in their timeline, the Badab War. If there is one event that truly cemented the Lamenters' reputation, it's the Badab War. Long before the secessionist conflict started, the Lamenters served as part of the Maelstrom Wardens, a coalition of Space Marine chapters tasked with containing the horrors emerging from the Maelstrom. The Astral Claws, under Chapter Master, I'm not pronouncing his first name here on, led this effort. And importantly, unlike many Imperial organisations, the Astral Claws accepted the Lamenters as allies. This matters, because by this point the Lamenters had spent centuries being viewed with suspicion due to their origins in the Cursed Founding. They now found themselves a part of something greater, the Maelstrom Wardens. They now had somewhere they belonged. The wider dispute that would eventually become the Badab War didn't begin with chaos worship or open rebellion. It began with a disagreement over resources. The Maelstrom Wardens believed they had been given an impossible task. They were expected to contain one of the most dangerous regions of space within the Imperium, yet many felt they were receiving inadequate support from Terra, while vast amounts of manpower, materials and wealth continued to be extracted from the worlds under their protection. From Huron's perspective, at least at the beginning, and likely from many within the Maelstrom Wardens, the resources of the Badab sector were better spent defending the sector itself than disappearing into wider Imperial bureaucracy. In 903 M41, the Astral Claws, Lamenters and Mantis warriors signed the Articles of Just Succession. This was the pivotal moment. The signatories effectively declared that the worlds they protected would cease paying Imperial tithes until the security situation in the region was resolved. To Imperial authorities, this was open defiance. To many within the Maelstrom Zone, it was a practical response to an increasingly desperate military situation. This is where the Lamenters found themselves trapped. From Terra's perspective, they had sided with rebels. From the Lamenters' perspective, they were standing beside long-standing allies who were attempting to fulfill the duty they had all originally been assigned, protecting the Imperium from the horrors of the Maelstrom. Unfortunately, as the conflict escalated, Huron's ambitions expanded simply beyond withholding resources. The Astral Claws increasingly acted as though they were building an independent power base within the Imperium. More and more Imperial forces and Space Marine chapters would be committed to the conflict to bring Huron's rebellion to an end. By the time the shooting started in earnest, the Lamenters had already committed themselves to a side. And as would happen so many times throughout their history, loyalty would prove extremely costly. By the later stages of the conflict, they had already suffered severe losses, and at this point in their history, we also have evidence of enough Lamenters succumbing to the Black Rage to form their own death company, Then the Minotaurs struck. Through intelligence on Lamenters' fleet movements, the Minotaurs, loyal to the Imperium to a fault, isolated and crippled the Lamenters' flagship, the Martha Lacrimarum, the Mother of Tears. Containing their wounded, relics and gene seed reserves, it became a target the Lamenters could not abandon. The resulting battle shattered the chapter. Only 311 Lamenters survived, a few more were scattered elsewhere in the conflict. That was effectively all that remained, and yet even here, perhaps there's evidence they are not so unlucky after all. While many would assume the survivors captured by the Minotaurs would be put on trial by the Inquisition and damned, they were instead judged by a tribunal of Space Marines, neutral chapter masters. Because they had not turned to chaos, they were spared annihilation. Instead, they were sentenced to a century-long penitent crusade, as well as relinquishing many of their resources and remaining assets to the Minotaurs by way of paying reparations to their aggressors and covering the losses the Minotaurs sustained defeating them. For the Lamenters, this was merely a setup for the next tragedy. Hive Fleet Kraken. Recuperating as best as they could after the Badab War and the loss of much of their equipment, they set out on their penitent crusade along with the Red Hunters chapter, who were tasked with standing vigilant over them and ensuring the Lamenters completed their crusade. This penitent crusade brought them directly into the path of Hive Fleet Kraken during the Second Tyrannic War, and at Malvolion, the Lamenters fought alongside the 15th Mordian Iron Guard in one of the most desperate actions of their history. Not for glory, not for territory, simply to buy enough time for Imperial civilians to escape. Again and again and again, the same pattern emerges. Chapter absorbed horrific casualties so that ordinary people could survive. At this point, they had already been reduced to only a few hundred battle brothers, and because of the conditions of their penitent crusade, they could not replenish their numbers until it was over. Every loss was effectively permanent. By the end of the campaign, they could barely field 3 companies, yet again being reduced to around 200 to 300 Marines. And this is where the meme comes from. When people call the Lamenters the unluckiest chapter in the Imperium, these are the stories they talk about. Looking purely at the outcomes, it certainly looks convincing. But there is another way to interpret all of this. Let's look at these same events again, because every major disaster in the Lamenters' history shares one thing in common. The Lamenters choose the morally right option, not the strategically smart option, the morally right one. During the 9th Black Crusade, they stayed and fought, prioritising the defenceless over themselves. During the war with the Orcs, they sought out a mission to rescue Imperial civilians. During the Badab War, they stood by allies they believed had earned their loyalty. And during the Tyranid invasions, they sacrificed themselves to evacuate civilians once again. Over and over again, the Lamenters prioritise people over practicality. That's unusual. Many Space Marine chapters are heroic, but they're not necessarily compassionate. The Lamenters often behave more like the Salamanders than many of their Blood Angel cousins. They see themselves as protectors, not merely warriors, and that changes everything. Because if you consistently choose the most selfless options available, your casualty rates are going to be horrific. If you refuse to abandon civilians, if you refuse to abandon allies, if you refuse to prioritise your own survival, then eventually that bill becomes due. Perhaps what people call bad luck is actually the predictable consequences of idealism. Other chapters retreat, the Lamenters stay. Other chapters cut their losses, the Lamenters hold the line. Other chapters choose survival, the Lamenters choose duty. And the universe punishes them for it. Outside of the lore, I think the Lamenters serve a very specific narrative purpose, and it's the reason so many people love them. They're tragic heroes. They answer a question that sits at the heart of Warhammer 40,000. What happens to genuinely good Space Marines in this setting? The answer is, they suffer. A lot. The Imperium doesn't reward compassion. The galaxy doesn't care about good intentions. Honour doesn't guarantee victory. Loyalty is not always rewarded. Decency often gets you killed. The Lamenters embody that truth better than almost any chapter in the setting, and that's why people love them. Not because they lose, because they keep going, no matter how many disasters strike, no matter how many battle brothers they lose, no matter how unfair the situation becomes, they keep fighting, they keep helping people, and they keep believing that doing the right thing matters, even when the universe repeatedly proves otherwise. So in conclusion, are the Lamenters actually cursed with bad luck? It's plausible. The evidence certainly exists. They come from the cursed founding, disaster seems to follow them everywhere, and if any chapter has a legitimate claim to being cosmically unlucky, it's probably them. But after looking through their history, I think there's another explanation worth considering. Maybe the Lamenters aren't cursed at all. Maybe they're simply what Space Marines would look like if they never stopped being heroes. And in the grim darkness of the far future, that might be worse than simply being unlucky. So there we have it. Are the Lamenters unlucky? Let me know what you think in the comments section below. Or are they simply the narrative vehicle to depict what would happen to the good guys in Warhammer 40k? Also, do let me know other 40k memes that you'd like to see featured in this Meme Buster series. The Blood Raven stealing things will definitely come in time, but I'd be interested to hear of other memes floating around the Imperium if you've got them. Consider liking this video if you've liked this video. Subscribe for more Warhammer content, but in the meantime, take it easy, and I'll see you in the next one.